A deafening explosion shattered the stillness, shaking the palace walls. The alarm bells rang through the corridors as shouts and the clashing of steel echoed from the outer gates. Unknown assailants, cloaked in darkness, had infiltrated the palace, moving with terrifying precision. Their target was clear: the king's chamber. King Olumide and Queen Mornike had barely risen from their bed when the doors burst open. The royal guards surged forward, their swords flashing under the torchlight. A brutal skirmish ensued as steel met steel, and the intruders, outnumbered but ruthlessly skilled, fought with lethal intent. The royal guards fought valiantly, forcing the attackers back into the corridor. More warriors flooded the palace halls. The air inside the grand hall of the palace was heavy with tension. King Olumide sat on his golden throne, his once proud shoulders hunched in exhaustion. His regal robes, though still magnificent, bore the weight of worry rather than royalty. The candlelight flickered across his hardened face, revealing deep furrows of distress. Across from him, Kelechi stood tall. His presence was not one of arrogance, but quiet confidence. He had seen the kingdom suffering, empty markets, desperate mothers, angry mobs. Yet, despite all this, King Olumide still refused to listen. "I will not allow this," the king spat, his voice laced with bitter resentment. "This boy, this very boy, caused the downfall of my kingdom. If Adanna had done as she was expected, if she had married Ojin, we would not be in this mess." Adanna, standing beside Kelechi, clenched her fists. "Father, how long will you continue to blame me? How long will you refuse to see that this crisis is beyond a single choice?" The economy was bound to collapse. Egbona and his family were waiting for a reason to strike. Queen Mornike, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of unspoken wisdom. "Olumide, you are a wise king, but right now, you are allowing your pride to blind you. Is it not better to seek help than to watch our people starve? Even the greatest of kings know when to bend, lest they break." Please subscribe and like. King Olumide slammed his hand against the armrest of his throne. "Bend. You ask me to bend for him." He pointed a trembling finger at Kikai. "A farmer's son? A man with no noble blood?" A palace chief stepped forward. His name was Chief Adederan, one of the oldest and most respected elders in the kingdom. "Your Majesty," he said gravely, "pride has its place in leadership, but stubbornness leads to ruin. The people no longer chant your name in admiration. They curse it in the streets. If something is not done soon, there may not be a kingdom left to rule." The king's face twitched. He had seen the anger in the people's eyes. He had heard the whispers of discontent growing louder by the day. Kelechi took a step closer, his voice calm yet firm. "Your Majesty, I do not come to you as an enemy. I come to you as a man who loves this land as much as you do. I have spoken to brilliant minds, economists, traders, and political strategists from Lagos and beyond. They have solutions, but they cannot act without your blessing." The king stared at him, breathing heavily. "And why should I trust you? What do you gain from this?" Kelechi held his gaze. "Nothing, except the knowledge that I did not stand by and watch Abukar fall." A tense silence followed. Adanna placed a hand on her father's knee, her eyes pleading. "Please, Baba, for once, let go of the past. Let go of your anger. Let's fix this, together." King Olumide closed his eyes and exhaled sharply. He was a man of power, a ruler whose every command had been law. But now, he was just a desperate father in a crumbling kingdom. The silence was unbearable. Every eye in the room was fixed on the king, waiting. Then, at last, he spoke. His voice was hoarse, but the words were clear. "Bring them in. Let's hear their plan." A wave of relief swept through the room. Queen Mornike sighed. Adanna smiled through her tears, and the palace chiefs exchanged glances of approval. Kelechi, however, did not gloat. He simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked out of the palace, to summon the experts who would determine Abakar's fate. The battle for the kingdom's survival had just begun. The 4 advisors, 3 men and 1 woman, stood before King Olumide, their expressions unreadable, their presence radiating an air of authority that unsettled even the most confident palace officials. They were no mere commoners seeking favor. They were experts, men and women whose reputations extended beyond the borders of Abakar, individuals who had turned failing economies into thriving empires. Kelechi had done well to bring them, but now, as they faced the king, it was clear that their conditions would be nothing short of audacious. The tallest of the advisors, a graying but sharp-eyed man named Chief Olorunfemi, stepped forward. His voice was steady, direct. "Your Majesty, our time is limited. We will be in Abakar for only 4 days." The king's fingers tightened around the carved armrest of his throne. 4 days. He scoffed. "Do you believe the ruin of an entire kingdom can be undone in 4 days? The lone woman among the advisors, a striking figure named Madame Sephinat, raised her chin defiantly. "We are not here to undo the past, Your Majesty. We are here to set the right course for the future." The king's eyes narrowed. "And how do you propose to do that?" Olorunfemi continued, unfazed by the king's skepticism. 2 sessions. That is all we require. One will be a public session attended by your cabinet, your most powerful economic minds, and your military and political officers. In this gathering, we will address the realities of Abakar's crisis, propose reforms, and establish a plan of action. The king gave a slow nod. "That is reasonable." "But," Madame Sephinat added, her tone sharper now, "the second session will be held in private. No ministers, no chiefs. Just your immediate family." The throne room fell into stunned silence. King Olumide's brows furrowed in disbelief. "My family?" "Yes," said a 3rd advisor, a young, bespectacled economist named Ease. "It is essential." The king scoffed. "My family is not responsible for policy or military affairs. What business do they have in a meeting of state?" Kelechi, who had been silent all this time, watched as the advisors stood their ground. He could see where this was going, and so could the others. "It is not about policy," Olorunfemi explained. "It is about influence. Every kingdom, every nation, every economy is shaped not just by rulers, but by those closest to them. We must understand the dynamics of your household, the factors that have led to certain decisions. Without this, any change we propose will collapse under the same weight that caused the ruin in the first place." The king leaned forward. "I will not allow my family to be put on trial in my own palace." Madame Sephinat folded her arms. "We are not putting anyone on trial. But we will not waste our expertise fixing what will only be undone by private forces we have not accounted for." The tension in the room was growing thick. Adanna took a cautious step forward. "Father." The king cut her off with a raised hand. His jaw was clenched, his eyes cold with defiance. "No. I will agree to the public session, but I will not permit you to question my family. It is unnecessary." Ease sighed, shaking his head. "Then we have no business here." Olorunfemi gave a small bow, but his voice was firm. "If you will not give us full access, we will leave at once. We do not beg kings to save their kingdoms." The advisors turned as though ready to leave, their robes sweeping the polished floors as they headed for the door. Gasps rippled through the room. The ministers exchanged nervous glances. Even Kelechi was stunned. He had known these were people of integrity, but he had underestimated their resolve. It was Queen Mornike who saved the moment. "Stop," she commanded. The advisors paused. She turned to her husband, stepping toward him with a slow, deliberate grace. Her voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of a woman who had been silent for far too long. Olumide, must you always fight every hand that reaches out to help you? The king turned to face her. His wife, the one person who had stood beside him through every triumph, through every failure. There was no anger in her eyes, only exhaustion and something far more dangerous, disappointment. Listen to them, she urged. You do not have to like it, but you have to trust that there are things you do not know, things you cannot see from where you sit. If you truly want Abakar to rise again, then let them do what they came to do. The king's fingers trembled slightly on the armrest. His pride and his fears battled against reason. He hated this. Hated feeling like he was being forced into submission. But he could also see the anticipation in his ministers' faces, the quiet pleading in Adanna's eyes, and the cold certainty in Kelechi's posture. Please subscribe and like. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "Fine." The room exhaled collectively. You will have your 2 sessions, the king said more clearly now. His lips curled slightly in distaste. But if you attempt to disgrace my family, I will personally throw you out of my kingdom. Madame Sephenat simply smiled. We are here to help, not humiliate. And with that, the fate of Abakar was set into motion. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The moon, hanging low in the sky, bathed the palace in silver light, casting long, haunting shadows across its courtyards. Then, chaos erupted. A deafening explosion shattered the stillness, shaking the palace walls. The alarm bells rang through the corridors as shouts and the clashing of steel echoed from the outer gates. Unknown assailants, cloaked in darkness, had infiltrated the palace, moving with terrifying precision. Their target was clear, the king's chamber. King Olumide and Queen Mornike had barely risen from their bed when the doors burst open. The royal guards surged forward, their swords flashing under the torchlight. A brutal skirmish ensued as steel met steel, and the intruders, outnumbered but ruthlessly skilled, fought with lethal intent. The royal guards fought valiantly, forcing the attackers back into the corridor. More warriors flooded the palace halls, the king's finest, overwhelming the intruders. Seeing their plan failing, the assailants retreated into the shadows, vanishing into the labyrinth of the palace before disappearing entirely. The dust settled, and the damage was assessed. The palace had held. The king and queen were safe. But the victory was hollow. Because one person was missing. Nina is gone. The realization sent a wave of horror through the palace. The princess's beloved maid had vanished without a trace. The queen clutched her robe, her eyes wide with shock. Adanna stood frozen, her breath hitching. The palace guards exchanged uneasy glances. This was no random attack. Someone had come for something, or rather, someone. But the true terror struck when the guards checked the guest chambers. They were empty. The 4 advisors, gone. A cold dread spread across the palace like wildfire. King Olumide's chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands clenched into fists as his voice thundered through the halls. Deploy every soldier. Shut every gate. No one enters. No one leaves. The guards scattered instantly, their heavy boots pounding against the stone floors as they sprinted into action. The full weight of the kingdom's tactical might was unleashed. Search parties were organized. War drums began to beat across the city. Riders mounted their horses, galloping into the dark streets. The kingdom of Abakar was under lockdown. Adanna's strange reaction. While the palace buzzed with tension, Adanna remained oddly unruffled. She sat gracefully in her chamber, her fingers playing absent-mindedly with the delicate embroidery on her sleeve. When her father, still trembling with fury, stormed into the room, she barely lifted her gaze. Adanna. His voice was sharp, dangerous. Your maid is missing, and you sit here. She exhaled, a slow, bored sigh. She is a maid, father. Maids disappear all the time. You will get me another. The words were a dagger to his pride. King Olumide's face twisted in sheer disbelief, his rage bubbling over. Adanna, if you do not leave my sight this instant, I swear by the gods, I will strike you where you stand. But Adanna smiled. A slow, knowing, almost mocking smile. Without a word, she rose, turned on her heel, and walked out. Her father watched her go, his fists shaking at his sides. Something was terribly wrong. And for the first time in a long time, King Olumide felt something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Fear. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the city of Abeka, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the palace remained shrouded in tension. The night's horrors still lingered in the air like an unshakable shadow. The king had not slept. He sat in his chamber, his mind a battlefield of questions with no answers. Who had attacked the palace? Why was Nina taken? And worst of all, where were the 4 advisors? The drumming of heavy boots echoed through the halls. A guard burst into the chamber. Your Majesty, they have returned. King Olumide shot to his feet. Please subscribe and like. Who? His voice, raw from the night's shouting, came out almost as a whisper. The doors swung open, and in walked the 4 advisors. They were completely unscathed, calm, composed, and confident as if the night's terror had been nothing more than a passing dream. But they weren't alone. Right behind them, walking with the same effortless confidence, was Kelechi. And beside him, Nina. Fresh, untouched, unbothered. She moved with an air of serenity, her expression unreadable, as though the past hours of chaos had simply never happened. There was not a single sign of distress, no trembling, no fear, not even the slightest hint of discomfort. She might as well have woken from a deep, peaceful slumber. The king's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to demand answers. Where had they been? How had they returned? But before he could utter a single word, one of the advisors, a man with piercing eyes and an air of absolute authority, handed him a file. Your Majesty, the man said in an even, measured tone. This is the draft of the speech you are reading today at the public conference. The king blinked. For a moment, his mind refused to process the words. Speech? Public conference? His world had turned upside down, and they were handing him a document like everything was normal? His fingers, almost detached from his own will, reached for the file. His lips parted to ask a question, but no words came. He looked down at the paper in his hands, then back at the advisors. Why, yes, sir, he muttered instinctively, his voice low, almost servile. The second the words left his mouth, his eyes widened in shock. What did I just say? But before he could correct himself, the advisors turned on their heels. With Kelechi beside them, they walked away, their movements slow, deliberate, and powerful. The king did not stop them, and before he could demand an explanation from Nina, she ran inside, disappearing into the palace without a trace. King Olumide stood frozen. For the first time in his reign, he felt completely powerless. Please subscribe and like.